Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first of three series of talks for our Columbia Climate School pre-college summer programs in partnership with Putney Student Travel. My name is Cassie, and I'll be facilitating the session today. We will get started very shortly with our speaker today, Jeff Schlegelmilch from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. I just wanted to introduce everyone quickly to and give you a bit of background about our summer offerings this year with Putney Student Travel. So we are going to be doing a series of traveling programs with Putney this summer to different locations within the US and internationally. We will have trips to New York City, California, Alaska, and Iceland. It's very exciting to be doing these partnership programs, and Columbia Climate School faculty will be joining each of these programs depending on the theme and focus of each of the traveling programs. We're also going to be doing our Columbia Climate School in the Green Mountains program, which is a 2-week campus-based residential program, which will take place at Castleton University in Vermont. So all of these programs in our portfolio with Putney are really meant to engage young learners at the high school level, as well as rising grade 8 students in discussions around climate change, sustainability, and with a real focus on what students can do within their own communities. Each of the programs has a slightly different focus and theme. The Vermont campus-based program is really meant to provide learners with a comprehensive overview of the different and important aspects of climate change, everything from the science of climate change to the impacts, what we might be able to do about the impacts within communities, what do we need to think about when it comes to sustainability, policy, science communication. So really it's a fairly comprehensive overview, as I said, of what is going on currently with the state of climate change. Each of the trips that we are offering will focus more specifically on a particular theme. So our speaker today, Jeff, works in the area of disaster preparedness, and he's going to be leading the American West California trip. And you'll see on our webpage here, which I'll share the link to shortly as Jeff is getting started. But these are our 4 trips that we are offering, and Jeff's particular trip for American West is happening July 9th to the 20th. And so we're very excited about these upcoming opportunities that are going to be in person this summer, and looking to engage with you all. And we're really excited to have you joining us here today. We're also going to be holding an info session where we'll discuss more of the mechanics of each of the programs, applications, what to expect, what a day in the life of the program looks like. And that will take place on February 3rd at 5 p.m. And I will also share the RSVP link for that in the chat. So without further ado, actually, one more thing, we are going to be using the Q&A box today, and Jeff is going to give a short overview of some of the topics that he usually works with on a daily basis, and kind of give you a sneak peek of some of the content to expect if you're interested in joining the American West trip this summer. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Jeff.
Hi, great to meet everyone. Thanks for logging in this afternoon and talking through some of this. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of talk through a couple of different things about who we are, who I am, what our center does, and some broader disaster themes. These are the kinds of things we'll be kind of talking about as part of the program as it comes together later this summer. And then from there, we'll Yeah, just sort of give a buffet of a couple of different things here and a taste of what's to come. With that, sorry, making a few adjustments here. When we talk about like what is this pathway to disasters and to doing work in disasters, we all come from very, very different backgrounds. Some come from the hard sciences and the social sciences. Some come from fields of practice. So I actually come from a background where it's kind of funny. I ended up in academia. I'd never actually planned on doing that. I worked more in the field. I started as an epidemiologist and a public health preparedness planner for the city of Boston, and then worked in kind of a consulting role with a health system and their Center for Disaster Preparedness before coming to Columbia. So I've done a lot of work in developing simulations and exercises and focused on community resilience and working with companies in the private sector, all towards, how do we take the best available science that we have today and make that work for the challenges that we face. What I mean by that is that whether we're talking about climate change or disasters, the science tells us a lot, but it also doesn't tell us a lot. These are very young fields as far as scientific fields go, and they overlap with a lot of different fields. And so the science doesn't have all the answers, but it has a lot of good direction setting for us. And so we spend a lot of time doing that. It's also worth noting, I did my undergraduate degree in theater studies, so took away via the arts to this field. So there's no wrong pathway to disasters and disaster science and climate science. There's something for everybody. So our center was started in 2003. It actually was originally at the School of Public Health. It was begun with some funding that came after the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the follow-on anthrax attacks, focused on public health preparedness and bioterrorism preparedness. And we've always had this focus on the most vulnerable within communities and the power of communities. Our founder, Dr. Erwin Redlener, is a pediatrician and a child advocate. And so we've always had a particular focus on children and disasters too. And you'll see that in some of our projects that I'll sort of give you a hint on some of the work that we're doing. And but we're always at this intersection of research, policy, and practice. And as I mentioned, sometimes we're conducting primary research, and other times we are taking the best available research, whether it's from us or someone else, and applying that. How can we translate that into tools that'll help us today with what we're facing? Before I get into that, I want to just sort of frame disasters a little bit, because there's, some areas of science tend to be very specific, right? Physics, looking at the physical world, chemistry, looking at the interaction of different chemicals, and then that has physical components to it. Biology, there's a lot of computer science, engineering, sort of have domains. Disaster science is sort of all of these different domains overlaid on each other. And I'll go over that in just a second. But when we look at disasters, we kind of classify them into three broad categories. And these definitions can change, but natural hazards, or a lot of times they're called natural disasters. There's some debate on whether we should use the term natural disaster, because in a sense, an earthquake, for example, or a coastal storm in and of itself is not a disaster. It's not a disaster until it interacts with society, with people, with vulnerabilities that we've built in the pathway of these things. But this is where you sort of get your natural disasters, your natural hazards. They occur through natural events. And actually, with the impacts of climate change, we can't even fully say that these are truly natural. There is some human components to a lot of these that can change some of the certain aspects of these disasters. Although underlying, they are natural systems that are being influenced. Then you have human caused but non-intentional. These are when things that we built a power grid and it fails. We built a factory and there was an explosion. A dam collapsed. So an infrastructure failure, a technological failure. Sometimes these are called technological disasters. It's a piece of technology that fails. And then there's the human cause, the intentional. So a lot of the funding that I first worked on in this field came out of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the follow-on anthrax attacks. It came out of intentional attacks. So we spent a lot of time in those early years really primarily focused on acts of terrorism and bad things that people would be trying to do to us. And it wasn't really until Hurricane Katrina hit that all of a sudden a lot of the national focus on this started to switch back and realize, wow, we have some really serious threats from natural hazards. And actually, ironically, Hurricane Katrina had a very large portion of the disaster was caused by the levee failures. So a big piece of infrastructure failing. So when we talk about the different kinds of science that kind of intersect with disasters, we have, again, just to oversimplify a little bit, we have the hard sciences, your traditional earth sciences. And actually within a lot of groups within the climate school, there's a lot of great work on disasters being done on understanding earthquakes, understanding the atmospheric conditions that lead to storms, how human-caused climate change influences these things, volcanic detection equipment, and different measurement techniques to understand the world we live in that directly applies to these sorts of hazards. So these are very traditional kind of branches of science that have areas that apply to disasters. And so people will conduct a lot of research directly applicable to that and use the tools and the knowledge from those sciences to better understand those aspects of a disaster. Then we have the social sciences, sociology, psychology, political science. These are the things that sort of overlay on top of that. So we have the technology to detect a volcanic eruption. Where do we put it? How do we pay for it? What do people do when the warning system goes off? How do they deal with the uncertainty? This is a lot of the social sciences, and a lot of disaster centers are sort of rooted in social science because a lot of how disasters play out and are managed are part of these social systems. So again, we see this overlap of all these different branches of science. And so you'll see disaster experts who may be a volcanologist or who may be a sociologist, and they all sort of look at it from different vantage points. And from all these different vantage points, we get a more realistic picture of all the components that come together and create a disaster and determine who does well in a disaster, who doesn't. So in practice, how do we use this research? Well, first and foremost, training is the most obvious. Training and education. Teach people about what the science says. That's the simplest way. But then if you look here, we have sort of in the middle column here some simulations, some exercises, and that turns into, on the bottom, you see people in protective equipment. So we know different chemicals can harm us and different barriers can keep those chemicals from harming us. On the left-hand side, these folks walking towards the plane, that's actually us in Texas after Hurricane Harvey. We were working with some celebrity donors who wanted to give some money to help out with the recovery and wanted to know where their money could go the furthest. Well, to do that, we have to understand the damage that's on the ground. We have to understand the social dynamics, who is helping, but maybe isn't connected with the resources to do more help. Some of these community-based organizations that could really benefit from this. So there's a lot of social science with that as well too. And on the right-hand side, some of our trainings and some mapping technology. We know social vulnerability is a strong way to understand overall disaster vulnerability. And by overlaying that on the path of a hurricane, you can get a sense on what areas are going to need more help. And also in preparedness, what areas would benefit more from investments of certain kinds. On the policy side, so it's also, so we have these frameworks, we have these legal frameworks on how to, how we spend money, how we define disasters, how we determine where it goes. These are some examples here from a couple of different projects, but our Resilient Children and Resilient Communities initiative. We worked with members of the community who are conducting a congressional briefing here, and these are meetings at the White House to talk about what's going on in communities, how these policies help, and maybe how they sometimes get in the way. will write op-eds and articles. And actually this one, we were filming a documentary. They were asking us to help frame. It was on a hackers call for code, people using technology to develop new technologies in their community to help out after a disaster. So they had all these great case studies of folks doing this. And we were there to help frame it all and talk about how it relates to broader disaster and how important this is and how it should be fostered. And actually, I'm going to skip this graphic because I have a better one I'm going to share with you. I'm going to stop my sharing for a minute, and then I'm going to share a different screen, which is, here it is. So this is actually a graphic that we put together as part of some policy briefs for our Resilient Children, Resilient Communities initiative. And what we were looking at was we were looking at different policy areas of things like poverty and food security, mental health, housing, things like that, and working with our communities to understand how these dynamics played out in their community. And so when we look at all these different branches and all these different things, you're usually looking at it as, okay, let's put money into childcare. Let's put money into mental health services. Let's put money into disaster resilience. And so what we see here is, let's say you want to put money into food security to help people make sure that they have, this was a big part, has been a big part of the COVID-19 response. So we put some positive money into that. You see it having a downward effect, reducing poverty, improving mental health, and sort of having this cascading effect, positive effect for resilience, for childcare, for education, because these are all interconnected. We reset this and let's say we're going to cut mental health programs. We don't want to spend the money on that anymore. And then we start to see increases in poverty. They have these negative effects that cascade and sort of perpetuate across the whole system. So when we talk about vulnerability, it's really important to remember that these are all interconnected. And when we try to say everyone has equal access to something, that's not necessarily the case. Some people are absorbing the negative consequences of a lot of policies. And so we really try and step back and understand how this all relates, how this all comes together. I'm going to share one other screen. You hear about all this money coming out for COVID, trillions of dollars for COVID assistance. And so we looked at these focus areas of childcare, housing and shelter, mental health, access to broadband and education, poverty and food insecurity. And then we looked at the COVID disaster spending bills. And I'll show you the graphics down here. And so what you see on the left-hand side is the full range of money that was made available. But on the right-hand side, how much actually went towards education, childcare, and you can barely detect the investments in mental health services. So it's talked about a lot as part of these big packages, but how much actually sort of reaches these different issue areas. And we've done this for each of the stimulus packages that have come through. So this is an example on how we look at policy, how we look at how this is set up on the left-hand side and how much actually impacts these needs, and if there needs to be a rebalance of some of those things. And then we have some really smart people who work with us who can also make really cool visualizations like this. And communication is a big part of the disaster cycle. I'm going to go back to my slides. The slide that I was sharing here previously kind of shows just the interconnection of things like political science, engineering, ecology. So very similar, showing the connections. I like to show this because we have fields of study in all these different branches, but really it's at the intersection that the experience of resilience is. It's not in any one field, it's how all of these fields actually work together or work against each other that determines what we experience. A colleague, Daniel Aldrich from Northeastern University, does a lot of work on social determinants and social cohesion and social capital. He's written a lot on this. I like his book, Black Wave, on Japan's triple disaster, the earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima meltdown. Because it's actually written in a way that a lot of the hard science is in an appendix, and a lot of the stories are up front. So as a scientific work, it's one of the easier ones to read, although this work has been done a lot of places. And I think a key thing that we're learning is that, you know, we have investments in the physical environment, but the social environment, these horizontal connections, neighbors helping neighbors, is a very, very strong signal on how people do with their health and their mental health after a disaster. So what this means is that while we want to invest a lot in physical environment, floodplain management, fire resistant roofs in wildfire areas, things like that, there's also a tremendous benefit to actually investing in social infrastructure, making sure that people have places to come together as a community, that they're connected with one another. These vertical connections is how well you are connected politically to the voting rates and things like that, because when money comes in after a disaster, it either comes through or is coordinated by a political structure, and the power of that political structure and who they're connected with is a very strong predictor. If you're well connected and enjoy the benefits of society before a disaster, you're more likely to enjoy them after. If you're disconnected, marginalized before a disaster, you're also going to have trouble getting access to those resources afterwards. So looking at disasters, we can't understand disasters without understanding our own inequalities and our own unequal structures as a big component of how we set the table for that disaster. I like to show this too. This is something my colleague Daniel Aldrich talks about a lot. This is from Japan. These are pictures that I pulled. Ooh, I didn't cite them. I stole them quite literally now because I didn't leave the citations. I think but they're basically just from graphics of from news articles. So on the right-hand side is a modern effect of creating these seawalls to prevent tsunamis from coming on shore. What Daniel Aldrich would talk about is how these seawalls were largely ineffective against the tsunami for the 3/11 disaster. The waves largely overtopped the seawalls and they didn't work. And yet I spent billions and billions more rebuilding them and building them in a lot of other places. And a lot of communities didn't want them. And as you can see, it cut off access to the sea. And so in some cases there were fisheries or there was a tourism industry. And so here you have physical resilience being improved, but social resilience and possibly economic resilience being diminished. So if we're only looking at it as an engineer or from the built environment, we like to call, the built environment is basically the environment we build, roads, bridges, tunnels, all that sort of thing, then it's a good investment, right? Because it makes the physical infrastructure more resilient. But if we look at it from a societal level, then we may have actually created more vulnerability, right? We may have eroded social resilience as a result, and the trade-offs might not be as great. And this will vary where you go and things like that. I'm not trying to be overly critical of this particular approach. It's just has some visuals, so it's easier to show examples of. And it's not the same in every town. Some are happy to have this, others are not. The other thing I'd point out is on the left-hand side. So these are ancient stones on the sides of the mountains. And so hundreds of years ago, when there was a tsunami in Japan, they would put these stones and they basically say, don't build below this marker. And so it's an ancient way of doing this, is that, okay, you take the high water mark, you put a big stone there and you warn people, you build below this, you're going to be vulnerable. So again, it's a very, very different technique, and one that was employed a long time ago, and one that, some towns want the seawalls, some of them want the markers. They're willing to actually move the town more rather than cut off more of that ready access. These are the kinds of debates, these are the kinds of trade-offs that we're confronted with disasters, but also with climate change, with rising sea levels and things like that. Not much here. I'm gonna just pass through these. So one thing I want to talk about too in the US, so during the Great Depression, to stimulate economic activity, the Home Owners Lending Corporation, I forget the exact name, was created to actually help promote lending for people to buy homes, to stimulate the economy. And what resulted was what ended up being a very racist structure. And what I mean by racist structure is it actually created inequalities by race that have been self-perpetuating even to this day. So what it did was it drew lines around neighborhoods. And if you were, and this is where the term redlining comes from, if you were in a redlined neighborhood, you couldn't get a home loan. If you had a home, you couldn't sell it. If you wanted to get a home in the neighborhood, you couldn't get it. Those neighborhoods were predominantly African-American neighborhoods, predominantly majority minority neighborhoods, and to this day remain sort of socially packed. Because what it did was it created lack of economic mobility. If you couldn't buy a home, if you couldn't create and preserve and pass on wealth, then you were sort of stuck in this cycle of poverty. Blue line, green lined areas, which were wider and wealthier areas, had easy access to loans and really benefited from these policies. And so what that means and what these studies are showing, so what it meant is it didn't just mean you couldn't get a home loan. If property values were lower, there were less investments in infrastructure, less investment in the power grid, in floodplain management, in trees. And so Redfin, this real estate firm, is looking at flood vulnerability today and is finding that neighborhoods that were redlined 100 years ago today are at higher risk of flooding, significantly higher risk of flooding. So we see a vulnerability from policies and practices from a century ago that are still creating very, very real and profound vulnerability on the same unequal terms as a century ago. On the right-hand side, you see these two pictures. The left is the Upper West Side, a very wealthy neighborhood in New York City, and on the right in Harlem, which has historically been primarily African-American and lower socioeconomic status, although it's gentrifying. Some of that is, a lot of things are changing. But what it shows, just look at the tree cover, the investment in sort of tree cover in these two neighborhoods. And what you find is very similarly, formerly redlined areas on average are going to be 5 to 12 degrees Celsius hotter. You have these urban heat islanding effects, and urban heat is a large factor in terms of health outcomes. In areas that were formerly redlined, you also have older housing stock, less energy efficient buildings, which means you have to pay more to keep them cool. So that has an economic effect. And so it's harder to keep the area cool, one, because it's hotter, and two, because the buildings are older. So you see, again, the graphic with the arrows bouncing all around, the arrows just start bouncing and cascading all around. And so the way we look at disasters has to look at the physical environment, the social environment, the economic environment, because they're all linked with each other. And again, the table has been set for this, with decisions made that had nothing to do with disasters generations ago. So finally, I'll just kind of conclude with a math equation, because I'm sure signing up for experiential learning, there's nothing you want more than for me to go over a math equation. There's a lot of different definitions of risk and resilience, and this is a way that I think really kind of helps to capture it, is that the risk is the hazard, the bad thing that's trying to happen, times the vulnerability. If you have a big hurricane coming and a lot of stuff at sea level with a big storm surge, those are going to amplify off of each other. And that's divided by the capacity to cope. So communities with more resources, with lower social vulnerability, have a higher capacity to cope if they have more economic resources, if you more structures of civil society, so offices for recovery, things like that, then they're going to be better able to manage and absorb that shock than other communities. And so these are sort of the relationship between these different components. And so when we think about it, when we think about disasters, we have to think about all of this. We have to think about the bad thing that's trying to happen, the environment that it's occurring in, and then the social structures that are there that are layered on top of that. So I think that takes me to the end. And I'd say, I think when we're in California and when we're talking about this, we're going to be looking at all of these things. It's a beautiful physical environment. And you really do see across the area that's being covered, from very industrialized areas, very built up areas, to very ecologically natural areas. and looking at these relationships between them. And first and foremost, looking at things like where the water flows and how it goes from the Sierras down to the Silicon Valley and other areas of high population. But then within that, what are the social dynamics? What are the political dynamics that come into play in terms of, as that gets more and more scarce, who gets it, who has access to it? Some of it is conscious decisions, some of it is kind of on autopilot, self-perpetuating because of you raise the price, only wealthier people can access it, things like that. So let me pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions or elaborate on this anymore. And just really excited at the interest for all of this, and frankly, quite proud of the Climate School and of the work that Cassie is leading to engage with all of you and continue to do this. So really, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Jeff, so much for that very great overview of an often daunting topic, which is disasters. And so I welcome the audience here. If you have any specific questions about the talk that Jeff just gave, or any questions about the program, feel free to use the Q&A box. Jeff, I'll get things started here. So in terms of, you gave Japan as this example of the sort of triple threats or multiple threats. And I think that faces more and more, perhaps more and more communities across the US as well, California in particular. And so, or there's also, I can think of, places like Louisiana or sort of Texas as well. We saw with power grid failure. I can't even remember when now. My sense of time is totally off. But these layers of risks and recovery is such an important piece of that. And oftentimes many communities don't even have an opportunity to recover yet. I feel like in New York City, there are places where we're probably still recovering from Hurricane Sandy, and that was many, many years ago. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit about just how complex risks and disasters are, but what happens in situations where there are multiple risks layered on top of each other, plus the inability to recover appropriately or put the infrastructure in place, and what happens there, and why the importance of those social connections that you talked about are perhaps even more important in those situations.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think vulnerability, as you mentioned, Japan as an island nation has a lot of coastal areas and a lot of vulnerability. At the same time, they actually have probably put more resources into preparedness than anyone. And so in some ways are a good model for how to do this, although some of Daniel Aldrich's work sort of shows the challenge of looking at it soul construction versus nature. And so, I think back to, I was in Barbados before the pandemic with an State Department meeting, and the Home Minister of Barbados was talking about how, as a country, Barbados is experiencing the impacts of sea level rise and climate change at a level that most countries are not, but they are not the primary emitters of greenhouse gases. So they're owning the choices and consequences. And then he also talked about how, as a poorer nation and with a lot of international loans, debt would be forgiven, but they would have to restructure their economy. So they couldn't focus on 20, 30-year projects. They'd be 10 years in and then be told to change everything as terms of a debt restructuring. But I think down to it even more so, looking at communities is, it's neighbors helping neighbors. It's when there's a fire and someone needs to be evacuated, and maybe they can't move themselves around very well. They're elderly or have medical conditions. It's a neighbor or a loved one who gets them out of there. During Hurricane Sandy, there were these horrible stories of people very socially isolated, with no power in high-rise apartments, stuck there with no plumbing, no food, and just stuck there alone. On the flip side, having those social connections means someone is coming to check on you, or you're going to check on someone else. So that's what it actually looks like with neighbors helping neighbors. And so when we look at all of these different things, I think that that's important to always sort of look at is, there's no single answer. We need to sort of look at all the different variables. And when we come up with solutions, it's not going to be just building something. It's not going to be just the social environment. It's not going to be just the political environment, but all these things need to be pointed towards disaster resilience. I should say too, the other thing I'd mention is, you talk about recovery. Recovery takes a decade or more from a major disaster, and we're seeing so many disasters now. The cameras just sort of move on to where the wind is blowing the hardest or where the water is rising, and these communities are still recovering. And so I think we also need to reframe how we think about disasters beyond just the very sort of photographable response moments, when actually a lot of the value is putting money before the disaster occurs. And the most important attention that communities need comes long after the cameras are gone in that long-term recovery process.
Right, definitely. And this is a very interesting question. I love this. Is there a threat that keeps you up at night that would be surprising to most people, or that is not sufficiently on the radar of enough people and public officials? And I think this is interesting because what we see in the media is not often the most accurate representation, perhaps, of real concerns and stories. So curious about your take on this one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get asked it all the time, and I never quite know how to answer it. So there's a few different ways I can answer it. There are some threats that I think aren't on the radar as much, but should be. Threats of nuclear conflict, in particular, is one that really changed shape. So during the Cold War, we had this notion of mutually assured destruction, where the US and the Soviet Union had so many missiles pointed at each other. Preparedness didn't matter. If the war started, that was it. Planet's gone. So no bother investing. So the Soviet Union fell, Cold War ended, and now we have sort of these, and anyone who had nuclear weapons sort of organized around, they picked a side. And there was something stabilizing about that. Now you have all these hotbeds of nuclear activity. You have North Korea developing nuclear weapons. You have Pakistan and India that have both sort of been in sort of an arms race with each other, and as a consequence, don't necessarily have all the safeguards. And so you have the possibility of suitcase nukes with terrorists bringing them. And it may sound scary, but it's a very different environment. So all of a sudden, in this kind of environment, preparing for a nuclear detonation makes sense because it's actually survivable in a lot of instances. But how do you have that conversation with the public? How do you do that? That being said, I think that, I guess that would be one of the more interesting answers I could give. Fundamentally, I think the hardest part and the biggest impediment is the boring stuff to talk about. And that is investing in preparedness. That is having an elected official endorse an idea that the voters aren't really going to care about today, but is going to save a lot of lives 10 years from now after the next several election cycles. We have these ways of doing things that make us very reactionary, and it makes it very hard to do the kind of long-term resilience building that would have the greatest impact. So the exciting answer is nuclear war. The boring answer is really needing to get better at doing the boring stuff that no one likes to listen to.
And I think on that note, so we're going to wrap up very shortly here, but I think on that note, just to come back to something that Jeff, you mentioned as you were talking about pursuing theater studies in undergrad, there is a place for everyone. And I think there are so many opportunities and places, especially for young people, who have new ideas and who are very innovative in their thinking. And I think that is the point that we would all like to drive home, is that there are so many opportunities to get involved, whether it's not going into sort of disaster planning. Disaster planning is not the only route if you want to have affect change and drive impact in your communities when it comes to dealing with climate change impacts in general. So I think that is, and I think the presentation really showed us the different aspects. It could be on the physical response side, the immediate preparedness, or it could be long-term recovery and resilience and preparing communities and working with stakeholders. So I think those are really important points for our audience here to take away. I will be sharing this recording with everyone, so you're free to go back and check out the talk again or share it with your friends. As a reminder, we are going to be holding an info session next Thursday, February 3rd at 5 p.m. for our summer programs. And we'll share a little bit more about the California trip at that time as well. Jeff, any last words you would like to share with our viewers?
I would just reiterate what you were saying too. There's really no wrong path, whether we're talking about, climate science and the broader work of the climate school and different ways it intersects, whether climate change or the disasters. And science is really designed to help tell us what is knowable, right? What is the value, how to quantify things, what to do, how to do it. But really to put a plug to, I'm actually, there's several of us in the disasters who started in theater and who started in the arts, and the humanities helps us understand why it matters, why we do the things that we do, why it's so important. And it's also, I think I would love to see more folks from the arts getting engaged with this as well too. It affects all aspects of society. We can use all the help we can get, and knowing folks like yourselves are interested in this and engaging on this certainly gives me hope. And I sleep well at night knowing that that you're out there studying this. So yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Jeff, for your time, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. You all have my email, and we hope to see you at our info session next week. And thank you again, everybody. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.